Good evening, Shakespeare students, and welcome to our last video lecture of the semester. This evening we will be looking at Margaret Atwood's novel Hag-Seed and discussing some of the links with that book to Shakespeare's play The Tempest. We will also address some of the issues related to the final exam. And also, address perhaps the wrap-up of the course. There will be a video conference question and answer period beginning at 7 p.m. this evening, so you will receive an invitation to that in your ULaval email inbox a few minutes before that time. That would be an opportunity to discuss both Atwood's novel, Shakespeare's play, as well as any other issues remaining with the class. So, Hag-Seed, if you all remember correctly, I would imagine you do, that we were supposed to be, many of us, most of us perhaps, watching Margaret Atwood being interviewed at the Salon du Livre de Québec this evening with Marie Laverge. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 crisis, that was annulled, and so we put the novel Hag-Seed on the syllabus due to the fact that many of you who I believe are taking Professor Tulloch's CanLit class, Canadian Literature, were perhaps required or at least strongly encouraged to go see that interview. So, and the fortuitous accident is that Atwood had recently written a book that was based on The Tempest, which was to be the play that we were studying this week. So that series of happy accidents is what put that book, this book, on the syllabus for us this semester. I think it's kind of a nice little twist because it allows us to look at Shakespeare through a slightly different lens. From a contemporary, sort of on the one hand, an homage, and also on the other hand, looking at it through a contemporary lens that might let us see certain issues. The book was commissioned by Random House, I believe in 2016. They did a series called the Hogarth Shakespeare series, and they invited a number of well-known authors to take on one of Shakespeare's plays and write a contemporary version, or write a contemporary work that in some way parallels that. And actually Atwood was the first one approached for this, and she wrote Hag-Seed, which is a modern retelling of The Tempest, and it focuses on some of the themes. So maybe I'm going to give a very, very broad overview first of The Tempest, and then connect it to Hag-Seed in case none of that is fresh in your mind. I know many of you have been working on your term papers, and so perhaps you have not been dedicating. I know a number of you have told me that you probably were having trouble dedicating the amount of time you would have liked to both The Tempest and Hag-Seed. If that's the case, I'm sorry to hear that. Unfortunately, due to so many things that have happened to us in the last weeks and months, it's just not like anything else, basically. So if you remember correctly, The Tempest is the story of Prospero and his daughter Miranda. Prospero is a magician who has had his dukedom usurped by his brother Antonio in Milan, but it's pronounced Milan within the play. And so he has been put in a leaky boat with his young daughter Miranda. This was 12 years ago, before the action of the play, and shipped off, and they end up landing on an island. And then the play begins with the eponymous Tempest, the big storm that is actually conjured by Ariel, who is one of Prospero's assistants, I guess would be a word, and Ariel creates this tempest, this storm that ends up taking Antonio Sebastian, and I can give you the list of characters here because we have Alonso, the king of Naples, Sebastian, his brother, Antonio, the brother of Prospero, Ferdinand, the son of Alonso, Gonzalo, an honest old counselor, Adrian and Francisco, who are lords, Trinculo, a jester, and Stefano, a drunken butler. And so these people are coming back from a wedding in supposedly North Africa, in Tunis, of Clarabelle. And on their way back from this wedding, they encounter this storm, and they end up shipwrecked as a result of it on Prospero's island. And Prospero's island is inhabited by Prospero and his daughter Miranda, as well as the aforementioned Ariel, who is one of his assistants, and another assistant, if that's the word we want to employ, by the name of Caliban. And so, as we mentioned last week, this play has a number of strong associations with colonial studies, post-colonial studies. There's a whole lot of connection to, the encounter between Europeans and Native Americans in the early 1600s, late 1500s, 1600s. We mentioned previously Montaigne's essay of cannibals that was seminal and very important for Shakespeare. There were a number of also of travelogues of people traveling to the Virginia colonies in North America, and this was something that was in the court at the time of Elizabeth and James. And so these stories were circulating. There was this kind of curiosity about these people, these other people, this encounter with these other people. And as I mentioned, that's one of the dominant critical modes in contemporary criticism with regards to the Tempest, is looking at these ongoing currents of post-colonial and colonialist issues alluded to by the play. And so basically, one of the key elements of the play is that Prospero is attempting to avenge the treatment that he received at the hands of his brother previously in the deep past. And so the Tempest and his desire to kind of conjure, bring these people to the island and put them in a certain set of circumstances that will perhaps bring about some measure of vengeance for him. That's the plot operation of the play. It's a wonderful play for a lot of reasons. I hope you enjoyed it, reading it. I hope if you had the chance to see either the Julie Taymor version of it with Helen Mirren, or one of the other versions, certainly the Peter Greenaway version, Prospero's books with John Gielgud in the title role, is really, really wonderful as well. And there are a number of other ones. I believe I posted a Richard Burton one. Anyways, it's a play that really, it gains a lot from seeing it staged. I think it's a very dramatic play. I mean, all these plays, obviously throughout the term, when we study them, one of the perhaps complicating factors being in Quebec is that English language theater is in often short supply in the city of Quebec. I know Robert Lepage, the local theatrical hero, has taken on actually a number of Shakespeare's plays. I can think of Midsummer Night's Dream and Macbeth, both that he's done. He's probably done more of them. Actually, I speak out the top of my head, but I saw a version that he staged of The Tempest that was staged at the Village Huron in Wendake, outside of Quebec. That was quite fascinating because it was done with non-professional actors. There were actually people from the community of the Village Huron, and the play, with all of its curious issues related to First Nation themes, that was a fascinating place to see it. It was staged outdoors. This is many years prior to all of the scandal that Lepage generated with Canada and Slav, these two plays, and how he casted them, and very recent controversies that he brought about. But the play had at its heart, it took the encounter with the First Nation people at its heart to really made that very, very central. But aside from that issue of Lepage's version of The Tempest, which, by the way, was so-so, the staging of it was quite wonderful. It was outdoors. It had this very, very exuberant, dramatic lighting and staging. The quality of the acting, you realize that when you don't have professional actors are professional for a reason, and they're often quite good. And there were a handful of roles in that. I believe both Miranda and Ferdinand, if my memory serves me well, were not very good, which is unfortunate, but it happens. That's the thing with the stage, is you get what you get. Some people are amazing and they do great performances, and some don't. But my original comment was basically that there's typically a paucity of English language versions of these plays being performed in the Quebec City area. So we very seldom have the opportunity to see live performances of them, which is unfortunate because Montreal, for example, they're quite frequent, and obviously in Anglo-Canada, that's a different dynamic. Curiously, one of the products of our situation right now that I believe James Shapiro, who is a brilliant scholar Shakespearean scholar from Columbia University in New York City, wrote an article in The Guardian about maybe a week or two ago. And he made mention of the fact that this is the first time in 200 years, over 200 years, that's been documented. It might be going back further than that, where there's no Shakespeare being played anywhere on planet Earth. I don't know if that kind of resonates with you or not, but obviously the theaters periodically get closed. During Shakespeare's time, the theaters got closed. The theaters are closed right now, along with the swimming pools and the schools and whatever else is closed. So just more collateral damage of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. It is what it is. So that said, this play, as I've said repeatedly, is really a very lively, dramatic play, very wonderful to see staged. And so watching those versions of it hopefully were rewarding for you. Now, the connections, Atwood, I put in at the end of the document that I posted for tonight's class of discussion questions. There's a rather long interview that took place at the Stratford, Ontario Shakespeare Festival. Probably it's 2 years ago. It was 2018, and it's an interview with Anthony. I can't remember his last name, but he's the director of the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, and he was also at that point staging a version of The Tempest for the Stratford Festival, and he interviewed Atwood talking about Hag-Seed, which had only recently come out, and they have a very far-ranging and very insightful conversation, I think, about that. I hope you've had a chance to watch that. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, I would definitely encourage that you make the time to watch it. If you care, it's not an obligatory thing, certainly. Like most of what I've been posting lately, additional material on the portail. Most of it's not obligatory, but this will certainly inform your understanding of the play and the connection to Atwood's novel. The interview is rather long. I believe it's around an hour and a half long, but only about the first half of it, I would say, is focused specifically on The Tempest and on the writing of Hag-Seed and what Atwood's objectives were and what sort of motivated her to approach it the way she did. But it's very enriching, I think, and worth seeing. So certainly, if you haven't had the chance to watch it yet, try to make the time to watch it at some point in the near future. As I mentioned previously, there will be one question among the choices for the final exam that will address The Tempest and Hag-Seed. It was considered that the material for tonight's class was optional because we had originally stated that the class would take place on Wednesday. Outside of there would be a supplemental class on the Wednesday, April 15th, in order to make up for the fact that we were missing tonight's class Tuesday because of the possibility of attending the lecture that obviously we are not attending. The interview with Atwood at the festival is a nice substitute for what we don't get to see in person. Unfortunately, it's not quite the same experience, but it's an interesting one. So anyways, Atwood, as I mentioned, was approached by editors of the Hogarth Shakespeare series to write a new work, a contemporary work, in conjunction, in parallel, or inspired by, or something of the sort, one of Shakespeare's plays. And she was very adamant in the interview, saying that this was the play that she wanted. If she was going to do this, it was going to be The Tempest, and that she clearly has a relatively serious enthusiasm for the play. So she made that choice, and she wrote Hag-Seed, which is, as we mentioned, a contemporary retelling of The Tempest. Now, a retelling is sort of a curious way to say it, because it's its own story, and it's the story of a gentleman by the name of Felix Phillips. And Felix Phillips is a theater impresario, a director, who happens to be the director of, I believe it's called the Makashawig Theater. And it's clearly, it seems to me anyways, clearly inspired by precisely the Stratford Shakespeare Festival. If you've ever been to this, Stratford, Ontario has a summer Shakespeare festival, probably the largest Shakespeare festival in North America. Stratford obviously sharing the name with the town of Shakespeare's birth, Stratford upon Avon in England, and Stratford in Ontario, perhaps due to that coincidence, in the onomastic coincidence of its name, has profited. And long ago, they started a very important summer theater festival that has grown and grown and taken on more and more importance, and it's quite well received. There are a handful of places, if we ever get to a normal summer, and you're looking for those opportunities, certainly Stratford is probably the best one in Canada. There's a handful in the U.S. You have Shakespeare in the Park in New York City, in Central Park, where you have free productions of Shakespeare plays. You have to go early in the morning and usually stand in line to get tickets, but they're free. And if you're ready to do that, you often get very, very high quality productions there. You have a good one in, I believe, Williamstown, Massachusetts, where Williams College is situated, and you have another one in Ashland, Oregon, the Ashland Festival. Those are probably the three most important ones that I can think of off the top of my head in the United States, and probably the Stratford Festival is by far the most important. It has the largest sequence of plays, and they bring actors from all over the world. On another side note, if you're ever looking in your days of quarantine, if you want to find something interesting to watch, there's a Canadian series that again has a weird connection to the Stratford Festival. It's called Slings and Arrows, and it was a series that each season is based on a particular Shakespeare play, and it's precisely cast as some sort of facsimile of the Stratford Festival. It's a festival atmosphere, and you have a theater company, and they're staging a play, and typically the process of deciding on the play, casting it, practicing rehearsals, ultimately performing the play takes up an entire season. You can find it, I think there's a lot of them on YouTube. I can't remember. I've watched a couple seasons. I think there's a Macbeth season and a King Lear season, and I think a Hamlet season. It's quite good. It's quite worth watching. Again, if you're looking for extra things to watch. So anyways, coming back to Hag-Seed, I've been digressing a lot. I typically do that, so my apologies in advance if you find that maddening or disquieting. Felix Phillips, the main character, is the director of the Makashwig Theater, which is based on the Stratford Festival, and he is kind of a rather curious character. There's a number. He's obviously the central character of the play, and he's the parallels the sort of the Prospero figure of the play. And so Felix is a curious character. As I said, he's the director of this festival. He's somewhat indulgent. You notice in the book they talk about him doing a version of Macbeth using chainsaws, which seems perhaps slightly over the top and a bit indulgent. They question his choice when he stages King Lear, the fact that does King Lear really need to take off all of his clothes in the famous scene in the storm in Act 3. And there are a number of his choices that he makes that one could question. So Felix is kind of this, he's the duke of his domain. He's clearly meant to parallel Prospero, and he's getting ready to stage for the festival his version of the Tempest, and he's very excited about it. He has a whole bunch of reasons as to why this play is the one that he's extremely excited about, and he has this very elaborately made cloak that will be the cloak that Prospero wears, and he has this cane, again, a cane with a metal head on it. I believe it has a fox's head on the top of the cane, and he's very excited about the props that he has for Prospero. And not only is he the director of this, but he intends to play Prospero in this staging of the Tempest. And as I said, he's shown to us to be somewhat indulgent and not very concerned with sort of the functional, practical realities of the theater. Now, a theater festival is a curious case, right? And we haven't really talked about that this much in the semester, but it's something that comes up often in Shakespeare studies, that Shakespeare was a playwright, obviously, but he was also an impresario. He was somebody who had a company, right? First, the Lord Chamberlain's men, that once King James became the monarch, they ended up having royal patronage, and they became the king's men. And that sort of helped them, obviously having the king being the most important theater company in the country. But there was still always the imperative of filling seats, selling tickets, and having productions that were successful. Some of what you see, some of the criticism that you read about, for example, the late romances, becomes an issue where Shakespeare was kind of zeroing in on a formula that was more successful financially. That the late romances they had elements of the sort of the pathos of the tragedies without the full-on pathos of the tragedies, and they seemed to be a bit more larger plays, more sprawling plays, and for whatever reason it was deemed that that last run of his career was when he really started being more financially successful. So Felix is a Prospero figure, the director of this, both the head of the festival as well as the director of the productions. But he doesn't seem to be preoccupied with the pragmatic realities of the festival and how these plays are going to be staged, and whether it's the budget or the various day in, day out things that a theater company has to deal with. He has a right-hand man whose name is Tony Price, and Tony basically sits in on all of the meetings with funding organizations and with the board and the various other sort of bureaucratic aspects of the of the festivals running, and Felix is kind of happy to not have to be bothered with that. He's sort of this artistic, indulgent artistic figure who doesn't want to be waste his time on the petty issues related to the day-to-day functioning of the festival, and so he doesn't. He lets Anthony. He's delegating responsibilities, and he lets Anthony be the one who deals with those things. And eventually, what happens is that Anthony has let things slip. Felix thinks that he can be fully trusted as his right-hand man, and one day, almost out of the blue, Anthony comes and tells him that, well, you've been fired from your post as the director of the festival, and you're going to be replaced. And he was being temporarily replaced by Anthony, by Tony Price, his right-hand man. And this is, of course, in the midst of preparing for his production of The Tempest. So Felix has all of these props and all of this ambition to create this performance, which is kind of his crowning achievement, the way he sees it, but he cannot do that, and so he's summarily dismissed, and Tony takes his place. Now there's more backstory here. Felix also had a daughter, Miranda, who died when she was 3 years old. She died of meningitis, and what happens is that Felix was apparently involved in a production at the time. His wife had died before that, so he's a solo parent, and he's raising this daughter, but he's also the director of the festival, and so he's fully immersed in his responsibilities with the festival, and less fully immersed with his responsibilities as a father. He has people that are helping him take care of the child, but he basically, he abdicates that responsibility. Now, obviously, we can see probably a pretty strong parallel with Prospero in that respect if we think back to the beginnings of The Tempest, where we hear that Prospero had been not a very good duke in Milan, that he was preoccupied with other things, with his esoteric arts, and he's very happy with his books and with his staff and the magical workings that he is obsessed with, and he's a little bit less thrilled with the day-to-day responsibilities of being a duke. And duke as a political appointment, political position, is a leadership position. You have to take charge and you have to take responsibility. So obviously, in Atwood's retelling, there's a strong connection to the character of Prospero and to some of his shortcomings. Right? We can ask ourselves the question: why has Atwood chosen to present Felix this way? Because Felix is somewhat indulgent, and I'm not sure exactly how you, when you read The Tempest, how you see the character of Prospero, but clearly the character of Felix has some relatively glaring shortcomings. And so, obviously, having been, somewhat irresponsible, his daughter dies of meningitis, and basically what happens is he's kind of too busy doing other things to be aware of it until it's too late. And so, she ends up in the hospital while he's in the midst of a production, and she ends up dying. And he really misidentified the severity of the situation, and so he's haunted by this. His daughter, Miranda, there's a very important kind of poignant picture of her when she was 3 years old, obviously before she died, that he keeps with him. And her ghost is a presence with him. And so once he loses his job, he is forced into some sort of exile, and he ends up taking this sort of little shack. He moves out of his house and moves into this little shack that is being rented to him. It doesn't seem like it's fully ready to be inhabited. I believe he's taking his Wi-Fi and his electricity from a farmhouse, this is like a secondary building on a farm that he's renting from these people who live there. And so it has, he has to kind of do things to this house in order to make it livable. And he's, out in the middle of nowhere. And he starts to take on this alter identity because Felix Phillips, the theatrical director, is a very well-known figure in the community at large. And so he becomes Mr. Duke. And Mr. Duke opens up a bank account in his new name, and I believe he has a connection to someone who was one of his allies when he was the director of the theater festival, a woman by the name of Estelle, who seems like she's a kind of a wealthy socialite with some important connections. Curiously, the backstory here is another backstory, is that Tony Price, after he has a turn as the director of the festival, becomes a minor provincial politician, and then over time becomes a more important politician in the community. And both him and another person who has kind of story from Felix's past, a guy by the name of Sal O'Nally, who was, I think, a young colleague of Tony and Felix. And he becomes also a minister. And so these two figures, Sal and Tony, have these political careers that Felix seems to be watching throughout the novel. And they're growing in importance. They win elections, and then they eventually become national politicians. Meanwhile, Felix has maintained his connection with Estelle, and Estelle has found the perfect gig for Felix, which is kind of a literacy program being held in a prison. I believe it's the Fletcher Correctional Institute. And so Felix takes on this program whereby he will stage a Shakespeare production in the prison, using the prisoners as actors and as the production, basically the people who put the production together. So the stage hands and the set designers and everything is done within the prison. And so Felix has staged King Lear and Macbeth, and over the course of years, and now he is working on his famous production that he had started at the festival, the production of The Tempest. And so much of the action of the novel is, again, preparing for the staging of this version of The Tempest. And so we start to meet the various prisoners who play roles within the play. So you have, all of the roles are held by prisoners except the role of Miranda, because it's the one female role in the play, and it's obviously a male-only correctional institute, and so none of them want to play the role of Miranda. And so Felix knows that in certain circumstances he has the budget and the freedom to bring in a professional actor or actress, and actually the person he brings in is a woman. Her name is Anne-Marie Greenland, who was going to play his Miranda in his original version of the play. So he had already cast her for that role. This is now, I believe, 12 years later, again, paralleling the timeline of Shakespeare's play. And so he brings her in to take on the role of Miranda within the play. And so there's a whole bunch of material related to setting up the play. I'm assuming you read it. I'm also assuming that some of you haven't read it, so I'm going over it in sort of broad terms. and maybe I'll summarize a little bit more and then talk about the connections between the two. So, in the process of setting up this performance of The Tempest, his two arch rivals, Sal and Tony, who are these government officials. One of them is a heritage minister, and I don't remember the title of the other one. But they are starting to agitate for funding for the program that Felix is in charge of, this literacy outreach program in the prisons, which is actually something that happens a fair bit. And it's quite successful and quite wonderful, these types of programs where incarcerated people are given the opportunity to engage with the arts, and sometimes the results are quite wonderful. So, and Atwood talks about this a bit. She talks about it in the afterword in her book, and she talks about it also in the interview that I've given you all a link to, the idea of what exactly these things are. There's an element of, orange is the new black, a little bit this kind of morbid kind of curiosity with prisons. And so they put together this production, and there's all sorts of, you have the various prisoners and various elements of their personalities that associate them when he's trying to cast, who's going to be Antonio and who's going to be Ferdinand and who's going to be, Caliban. And so there's all this drama associated with that. Interestingly, Ariel, the character of Ariel, is initially one that also the prisoners don't want to take on because they feel like he's a fairy. He's kind of it's not clear actually. Ariel, in the traditional productions of The Tempest, there's been a fair bit of gender fluidity, that Ariel has been often cast as a female role. It's not clear. I mean, it's a non-human role, so I imagine there's a fair bit of flexibility there. So initially, the inmates are not thrilled about the possibility of being cast in the role of Ariel. However, Ariel is a role that also will require some sort of magic, and it's the one person in the play who will have access to computer usage in the production. And so suddenly everybody wants to be part of Team Ariel, because Ariel is going to have access to certain things, and it sort of has the magician, the magical quality to it that's noted in the play. So anyways, the casting of the play is kind of curious, and there's a lot. Atwood spends a fair bit of energy on that. And then eventually it turns out that Sal and Tony are slated to visit the prison to see a recording of the production of The Tempest that Felix and his inmates have put together. And this is because there is a debate going on in the government about whether or not to fund this program. And so they come, and Felix has this very elaborate and convoluted plan of getting his revenge on his nemesis, Tony, and his other nemesis, Sal. And so Tony and Sal are coming, and Sal is also the father of a young man, Freddie, who actually has theatrical aspirations. He's actually a theater director in his own right. And so he comes with his son. And so we kind of have this very strong, easy parallel to see, because you have Felix, who is a figure very much like Prospero. He's been wronged. He's been, mistreated by people in the past. And now he is very meticulously constructing the opportunity to take his revenge. In The Tempest, Prospero has Ariel conjure the Tempest and has him create the conditions where Alonso, Sebastian, Ferdinand, and the others are washed up on the shore of his island, and then he kind of plays games with them, manipulates them, in order to put himself in a position where he can take his revenge and get them to renege and recognize how they have wronged him. In Hag-Seed, Felix takes great pains as well to orchestrate a situation where these people will be in his realm. They will be coming to the prison while he's there. And so he sets up this scenario where he's going to have them watching a version, a videotaped version of the play that they have put together that's going to be shown to the inmates and to the staff of the prison all at the same time. And he plans to have something where he will have these people drugged, brought secretly into kind of like a little cage, and torment them, much like what happens in the Tempest, where, if you remember, where Gonzalo and where Antonio and Alonso are, or is it Antonio and Sebastian, are kind of contemplating that they might take revenge and kill Alonso and Sebastian. I think I have those names mixed up, Alonso and Gonzalo, excuse me. And so, and suddenly Ariel comes out and freezes them and exposes their plot. This is paralleled here, where Sal and Tony are brought by some of the prisoners and given these drugs that then have them kind of slightly out of consciousness temporarily, and then they're brought and they're not sure what has happened. They think that there's been kind of like a violent takeover in the prison, and in particular Sal believes that his son Freddie has been separated from them, and he believes that he's dead. He heard what sounded like gunshots, and he believes that they've killed Freddie. Once again, in the Tempest, you have the parallel with Alonso worrying about Ferdinand, thinking that his son has been killed, and that fiction is maintained for an extended period. And so at one point during this very chaotic episode in the prison, where Tony is brought aside with another character, Siebert Stanley, who's a minister, another government minister, and they are plotting to say that they would like to kill Sal and another person that's with them, and blame it on the prisoners. And so they're recorded doing this, so they have this kind of blackmail tape in order to put Tony in his place. And so ultimately, when the siege, or the seeming siege in the prison ends, suddenly Felix has material that he can use to rectify his situation, basically. And so what ends up happening is that they eventually let Sal know that his son Freddie was not killed, and Freddie, actually, much like a parallel to the Tempest, Freddie starts falling in love with the woman who is playing the role of Miranda in the play. And so they gradually form an attraction for one another. And so, of course, Freddie, the son of Sal, has been kind of ridiculed throughout, that he was going to be this useless theater person. And so he is recuperated, and he has his own career trajectory that's useful for him. And his father comes to accept that. He's kind of traumatized, crying when he believes that his son is dead, much again like Alonso in the Tempest, when he's lamenting both Ferdinand is lamenting his father's death, and the father is lamenting his son's death. Here you have Sal, the minister, who is very saddened when he believes that his son has died. And so he obviously, a very strong parallel there. So all of these things, I think, create a very strong kind of microcosmic viewing of some of the major themes in the Tempest. One of the things that Atwood talked about, and is, I think, fairly eloquent about, is this idea that the play is about, prison and sort of restriction is one of the big themes in the play. Obviously, both Ariel and Caliban in the original play in The Tempest are victims to a certain extent of Prospero's forces, and he restrains them, and he has these two servants serving him, doing things for him and Miranda, right? So they benefit from the labors, and in particular, Caliban is this essential figure. I believe we touched on that a little bit last week, that the figure of Caliban is this earthy, essential figure, and he has this knowledge of the island. He has all these things that he can do, whereas Ariel is this corollary, the sense of imagination. But Prospero restrains both of them, and in the end, there's a sense of recognition on the part of Prospero where he finally relents and lets Ariel free. Again, one of those last scenes where Ariel has a discussion with him talking about if he were human, and I think it's one of the most beautiful scenes in the play, where he talks a little bit about revenge. And to me, this is a transformative moment for Prospero, where he becomes aware of the limits, what revenge is and why he might want it and how he wants it. And so he he ends up liberating Ariel. Obviously, setting the story in Atwood's version in a prison, and kind of contemplating some of the aspects of imprisonment is, it doesn't take on a very, I think, authentic. I don't think in the book, in Hag-Seed, we don't identify so much with the prisoners necessarily. I think Atwood, there are characters, they're compelling characters, but I think we stay mostly fixated on Felix and his goal. One of the things is that the person who plays the role of Ariel, Eight Hands, becomes much like Ariel is to Prospero, this completely important and very, very helpful figure in elaborating this complex plot that he has, in the same way that Ariel is the one who has conjured the storm and made it so that the people, the Italian courtiers, are brought to the island, and then he periodically freezes them and perplexes them. Similarly, Eight Hands, the person who plays Ariel in the play, is this computer whiz, a kind of a hacker who does all these things with computers and does all these special things and helps Prospero. In particular, there are aspects like having drugs that will render these government officials unconscious, and he helps him procure them and get them, and gets what he needs. And in the end, Eight Hands receives an early parole. So there's, again, a very strong parallel to the freeing of Ariel within the play that we see in Atwood's retelling of the story. So, obviously the theme of incarceration is a very important one, and the theme of revenge is obviously another very important one. So I don't know exactly how far one wants to go. I realize I've focused rather closely here on a retelling of Atwood's novel, and if you read it, then I don't know how worthwhile that was for you. I hope you can see some of the parallels that are there. So in the end, I think Atwood has done a pretty admirable job of making a contemporary work fitting the requirements of the series, the Hogarth Shakespeare series, and also making a standalone, very enjoyable read based on The Tempest, and staying to a very real sense loyal to the text, in the sense loyal to the essence and the intent of Shakespeare's play, even though it's thoroughly modern. As she mentioned, there's a lot of jokes in it in her interview. It's quite an enjoyable read. I think I found it quite compelling. I had actually read it not that long ago, and so rereading it made it brought it fresh to my mind and brought it to life. A very good job. By the way, there's another version that she's done that is a retelling of Homer's Odyssey from the perspective of Penelope, who is Odysseus's wife, while Odysseus is away at the Trojan War and spending this entire long epic poem very slowly making his way back to Ithaca. Penelope weaves and unweaves his funeral shroud and tries to delay the suitors who are waiting to make her their queen because they believe that Odysseus is dead. And so Atwood wrote the Penelopiad, which is the retelling of the Odyssey from Penelope's perspective. So if you appreciate this type of thing, it's not the first time that Atwood has done it. It's a worthwhile read as well. You're welcome to pursue it and tell me what you think. I enjoyed it, although I'm a bit partial to the Odyssey in that case. I guess I might be a bit partial to the Tempest as well, but those are subjective things, certainly. So that's mostly what we had to talk about here. I will certainly be available for you all to ask questions related to Atwood's reinterpretation of The Tempest. Similarly, I will be available on the video conference call in order for you to ask questions related to the final examination. I guess I'll speak briefly about that here. The questions will be posted this evening on the portail for the final examination. There are a variety of questions dealing with all of the plays that we have seen this semester. Typically the questions address two plays, or in the case one play where Atwood's Hag-Seed and The Tempest are in play. But basically you would choose one question and you'll have a week to construct your response to it. Obviously, under the present circumstances, you're free to use your copies of the plays. You're free to use your class lecture notes. You're free to use other resources. My intention in the assignment is not that you construct a copiously researched essay on these topics. Obviously, you could do that. You have a week and you have access to the world of the internet in order to pursue these themes. But my intention is mostly that you address the plays in the context as we've seen them in the class to show me that you have a mastery of the material. Now, as I said, there's no requirement to use secondary source material. However, there is a requirement that if you use secondary source material, that you be transparent and document the usage and honest, basically, that you acknowledge what you used and you reference it properly. I will have a very, very low threshold of tolerance if it seems to me that you're using material that you're not acknowledging. So please do make sure that you properly document any resources that you use. So this will probably be the last that you hear from me in my video capacity as a videographer. I will be available for you, obviously, for the question and answer period this evening. And I will obviously get back to you. Most of you, probably at least many of you, have already received your term papers back with comments on them. If you have not, if you've only recently turned it in, you will probably receive it shortly with comments and grades. As with everything, if you have any questions, you can certainly feel free to address them to me. I try to be as clear and straightforward in my comments and in my grading as I can. I try to document, what I thought the strengths of your work were and what I thought the weaknesses were, because I believe that the whole utility of giving you essays to write and then grading them and returning them to you is to be able to develop a critical eye and to be able to understand, what is good and what is bad as far as criticism goes. So, I hope that what I've done, you find it to be helpful, and I hope also that you've enjoyed the course. I can't say very much in the sense that the circumstances that intervened in the middle of the semester obviously made it a very, very different experience than would normally be the case. I apologize to the extent that our interaction was diminished in any way by those circumstances. It was certainly difficult initially for me and probably for some of you to transition, seamlessly towards that online model and leaving behind the classroom. So that was unfortunate. It is what it is. I hope you're all prospering under the the circumstances that we all find ourselves facing right now. And certainly, if you have any questions about anything, Shakespearean or otherwise, you can feel free to contact me. And I wish you all the very best. So have a good evening, and I'll see you shortly on the video conference call. Bye-bye.